There is a people who terrified the ancient world and left almost no trace of their own voice. The Persians built the greatest empire the Near East had ever seen, and then turned back from the Scythian steppe after losing an army in its vastness. Darius the Great, who had crossed into Europe and subdued the Macedonians, who had driven his forces into India, attempted to chase the Scythians across the Pontic steppe, and found that you cannot defeat an enemy who simply refuses to stand still. The Scythians burned their own grasslands ahead of the Persian advance, retreated endlessly, and waited for the army to exhaust itself against the emptiness. Darius withdrew. Alexander the Great crossed every boundary that had ever stopped a conqueror before him and then pulled back from the Scythian frontier, calculating that what lay beyond was not worth the cost of reaching it. The Romans, who eventually absorbed every enemy they could not destroy, never absorbed the Scythians. They simply waited them out. For over 400 years, between roughly 700 and 300 BCE, the Scythians dominated the Eurasian steppe from the Black Sea to the borders of China, the largest contiguous territory any single culture had ever controlled up to that point in human history. They were the first great nomadic empire, and, for centuries, historians and archaeologists assumed they knew what that meant. A coherent people, a unified culture, a shared bloodline moving across the grasslands as one. The genetics, when they finally arrived in force, dissolved that assumption so completely that researchers are still working through the implications. The story the DNA tells is not the story anyone expected. And it changes not just what we know about the Scythians, but what we think we mean when we use the word people at all. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the conventional picture looked like before the ancient DNA work began in earnest. The Scythians, in the textbook version, were an Iranian-speaking nomadic people whose origins lay somewhere in the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea. They were horse archers, masters of a hit-and-run style of warfare that the sedentary civilizations around them could not effectively counter. They buried their elite dead in enormous earthen mounds called kurgans, filled with gold, weapons, horses, and in some documented cases, the sacrificed retainers of the deceased. Some of the largest kurgans stood over 20 meters high and required the labor of hundreds of people across weeks or months to construct. Monuments to a social hierarchy that the steppe nomadic life had produced in forms that astonished the farming civilizations that observed them from a distance. Their art style, the so-called animal style, featuring interlocked predatory animals in dynamic poses, was distinctive enough to be recognized across thousands of miles of steppe from Romania to Mongolia. Greek traders who dealt with them along the Black Sea coast left written accounts of their customs, their fermented mare's milk, their elaborate burial rites, their apparent equality between male and female warriors. Accounts which Herodotus collected, and which later turned out to be broadly accurate in ways that surprised scholars who had dismissed them as exaggeration. The female warrior accounts in particular were long treated as Greek fantasy, until kurgan excavations across the steppe began regularly uncovering women buried with weapons, armor, and horse equipment in proportions that confirmed the ancient descriptions precisely. Archaeologists in the Soviet period and afterward excavated hundreds of Scythian kurgans and built a detailed picture of a culture that was consistent enough across an enormous geographic range to seem, from the outside, like the product of a single coherent population spreading outward from a common origin. This picture was not wrong, exactly. But it was, as the genetics have now demonstrated, profoundly incomplete in ways that force a rethinking of almost every assumption built into it. The ancient DNA work on Scythian populations began accelerating after 2015 as extraction and sequencing technologies improved enough to handle the degraded genetic material in steppe burials. By 2018, a team of researchers, including scientists from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, Harvard Medical School, and multiple Eastern European institutions had published a landmark study analyzing the genomes of over 100 individuals from Scythian-era burials spanning the entire geographic range of the culture. from the Pontic steppe in the west to the Altai Mountains in the east. What they found fractured the simple origin story into something considerably more complicated. The Western Scythians, the populations whose burials clustered around the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, showed a genetic profile consistent with what researchers had expected. A mixture of Eastern European steppe ancestry, the same Bronze Age pastoralist population whose westward expansion had spread Indo-European languages across Europe, combined with Eastern ancestry from populations further into Central Asia. This was the profile of a people with deep roots in the Western steppe, and it matched the Iranian language affiliation that historical linguistics had always attributed to the Scythians. But the Eastern Scythian populations, the groups whose kurgans lay in the Altai Mountains and the Mongolian steppe, showed a dramatically different genetic profile. Their ancestry was predominantly East Asian, with the steppe pastoralist component that dominated the Western populations appearing only as a secondary signal. These were not the same people as the Western Scythians in any meaningful genetic sense. They were populations with entirely different deep ancestries, different migration histories, different biological origins on opposite sides of the Eurasian continent, and yet their kurgans looked identical. Their weapons were the same. Their animal-style art was the same. Their burial rites followed the same template. The cultural package that historians had always treated as the marker of a single coherent people had been adopted independently, or transmitted across enormous distances, by populations that shared almost nothing in their genetic heritage. This is the twist that changes everything. The Scythians were not a people in the sense that word implies a shared ancestry. They were a culture, a way of life, a set of practices and technologies and artistic conventions so effective, so adapted to the specific demands of steppe nomadism, that populations across the entire width of Eurasia independently converged on the same solution. The horse archery, the kurgan burial, the animal style, the fermented mare's milk, none of these required a shared bloodline to transmit. They required only contact, trade, exchange, the slow spread of ideas and techniques along the networks that connected steppe communities across thousands of miles of grassland. A population in the Altai did not need to descend from a population in the Pontic steppe to become Scythian. They needed only to encounter the culture, recognize its advantages, and adopt it. And the genetics are now showing that this is precisely what happened, repeatedly, across the entire steppe zone, with populations of entirely different origin arriving at the same cultural destination by different biological roads. There is a specific burial that captures this paradox more vividly than any statistical analysis could. At a site in the Altai Mountains, researchers excavated the kurgan of a high-status individual whose burial goods were impeccably Scythian, gold ornaments in the animal style, horse equipment, weapons arranged in the prescribed manner. The genetic analysis identified this individual as having ancestry predominantly from East Asian populations, with almost no trace of the Western steppe ancestry that characterizes the Pontic Scythians. This person was, by every cultural and archaeological measure, Scythian. By every genetic measure, they were not related to the populations the ancient Greeks and Persians had interacted with when they used that word. The same name, applied across 5,000 kilometers of steppe, was describing something that was simultaneously one thing and many things, a cultural unity built on top of a biological diversity that no one had suspected. This finding has implications that stretch far beyond the specific question of Scythian origins, because the Scythians are simply the most dramatic and well-documented example of a pattern that ancient DNA is revealing across the entire human past. Cultural identity and genetic identity are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. They travel together sometimes for periods that can last centuries, and then they diverge, and populations that share an ancestry develop entirely different cultures. While populations with no shared ancestry independently develop practices so similar, they are archaeologically indistinguishable. The ancient world was full of people who understood this intuitively, who knew that the warrior on the horizon following the Scythian way might have been born in the Pontic steppe, or in the Altai foothills, or anywhere in between. And that the question of which clan or which origin mattered less than the question of how they rode and how they fought. Identity, in the steppe world, was not primarily inherited, it was performed. The way you rode, the way you fought, the way you buried your dead, the objects you placed in the kurgan, the animals you depicted on your gold, these were the markers that made you Scythian, not your grandmother's birthplace. Not the haplogroup in your mitochondrial DNA. The genetics are now confirming what the steppe itself always demanded. In a landscape where survival required mobility, where the herds moved and the people followed, and the borders between peoples were drawn in grass that grew back every spring. The idea of a fixed ancestral identity was a luxury that the steppe did not offer. What the steppe offered instead was a culture so perfectly adapted to its conditions that any population willing and able to adopt it could become, in a generation, indistinguishable from the people who had practiced it for centuries. The Scythians were never simply what we thought. They were never a unified people spreading outward from a single homeland, carrying a single bloodline across the grasslands of Eurasia. They were a demonstration, played out across 4 centuries and 5,000 kilometers, of how powerfully and how rapidly a way of life can spread when the conditions are right and the advantages are real. And what that demonstration reveals about the nature of identity itself is something that goes far beyond any single people or any single steppe. Every human group that has ever defined itself by ancestry alone was already telling a story that was simpler than the truth. The Scythians simply made that truth visible across a canvas large enough that even the ancient world noticed, even if it took modern genetics to finally read what was written there. The DNA is only now giving us the resolution to see how many different people were hiding behind the same name. And the answer is everyone. Everyone who chose the steppe, and the horse, and the wind.